Hello and welcome to our first episode of season 2 of Tshimong Talks. So anyone who's been waiting for a while, I think we've actually been getting feedback that we've had audience members camping in the vicinity for a minute. So welcome to everyone that's actually made way here to our second season. And what we do in this ecosystem really, what Tshimong Talks is a platform where young people are given an opportunity to unpack pressing issues that affect our society in general. Issues that affect the globe, and issues where young people themselves are really at the center of these conversations. So every time you see us online, every time you see us live on these platforms, you'll see something very interesting. You will see, guaranteed, us having a young person unpacking a very pressing and important issue today, right? So as you know, we have a fantastic relationship with the University of Johannesburg Library, and our partnership is growing onwards within this vicinity. And it makes so much sense that our first guest is from the University of Johannesburg, but I'll introduce you just now. So basically, our conversation and our topic as we open it today is around the war on Russia versus Ukraine. And we're seeing a situation on the African continent where a big discourse ensued right after this invasion occurred on Ukrainian premises and over the Ukrainian border. And we want to understand this conflict from an African perspective, right? So just to give you a quick background around this conversation specifically. So on the 24th of February, the world beheld in shock as Russia pursued a military invasion of Ukraine, sparking an intense war reminiscent of World War II. So basically, it was probably one of the biggest invasions that ever happened since World War II, as we know it, right? And what ended up happening within the global south, within conversations, especially on the continent, was a lot of contestation around the sentiment on this very war. In a world where Western countries and Western democracies across the world were condemning the war, on the African continent you had something completely different, where you had mixed reactions to this war. Specifically when we had the UN General Assembly sitting on the vote to condemn the war, we had many votes on the African continent. We had votes to condemn, we had votes to abstain, as South Africa did, and we had votes to completely agree with the war in general. So we had a very diverse sentiment that exists currently regarding this specific conflict. And to really help us contextualize this conversation and really take us through and understand the conflict that we're talking about, but most importantly, understand possibly a vision for an African and South African foreign policy, we have with us a good friend of mine, Dr. Bhaso Ndzendze.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having us.
We go way back, and I'm glad to finally join that exclusive pantheon of people who've been on this podcast as your guests.
Thank you so much. And I just want to say, because Dr. Ndzendze and I go way back, he insists that I call him Bhaso. So I'll do that. I know he's worked so hard, right, to be, the youngest head of department in South Africa, and worked so hard to have his PhD and such amazing accolades. But he said, you know what, because you and I go so back, let's take it back to Tammy and Bhaso. So thank you very much for gracing us with your presence here. How are you doing?
I'm keeping well. A little bit nervous. I feel like a criminal who's been called to court to account for some crime that is committed.
Absolutely. Let me tell you what you're accounting for. So, Dr. Ndzendze wrote a very, very brilliant article regarding South Africa's stance regarding this war, right? It's an article that was on the Mail and Guardian titled, Russia-Ukraine, Discretion is the Better Part of Valor in South Africa. And basically in this article, the driving thesis behind what Bhaso is giving us here is busting all myths regarding this specific war.
war, regarding sentiments that may be inflated, right? When we think of our relationship as South Africa with Russia and our relationship as the continent in general that existed in the colonial era. Am I correct in saying that? Why did you think it was so important to, off the bat, just release an article making sure that people have a deeper understanding of the context of this conflict?
Thank you for that question. So the motivating force behind the writing of the article and myth busting, as you rightly put it, was really to scale back, to take a step back and show actually that this is a complicated situation and that South Africa has no natural ally on either side, frankly, because there's been a lot of talk about the Russian Federation being a long-standing ally of South Africa.
Absolutely.
And that, if you're a South African that knows your history, you will naturally fall on the side of Russia and not find what its actions problematic.
Yeah.
So my point in this article really was to drive home a number of points, including looking at the Russia-South African relationship, in the very long term.
Yes.
Going way back.
That just now.
Going way back to the 17th century.
Yes.
When South Africa was being colonized, what was Russia's role in that? But also to really ask the question of who has the right to claim Soviet history.
Absolutely.
Is Russia exclusively entitled to that claim?
So what I'm going to do for this talk, for the purposes of this conversation, is that we're going to break down our conversation points into three. The first, we're going to talk about history, right? Again, history of the USSR, so that we can have a proper understanding of the historical context of this conflict, but the history of Russia-South Africa relations dating back to the 17th century, the Tsar Empire, and all the things that you unpack in the article. Secondly, I want us to discuss this notion of regionalism. And that manifests itself in two ways. One, in the formation of Brics and in that alliance. But two, the notion of a Pan-African unity or a Pan-African foreign policy, so to speak, and that being such a contested argument. And thirdly, is the driving part of this conversation, the notion of foreign policy and the power that foreign policy has and how it can be leveraged to achieve global peace and security, and how we can see ourselves as instrumental in playing that specific part. So let's begin with the historical element of the conversation. You speak about, he says something very interesting in the article. You speak about us needing to understand something very specific, that the USSR was a federation of many nations and not Russia alone. Please unpack that for a second.
Absolutely. After World War I, or rather during World War I,
yes,
the Russian Empire, which was ruled by an emperor, got into this war, and much like today's war with Russia, Russia's leaders are finding out a very unpopular war because it was a war of imperialism.
Yeah.
Right? This was world power politics. Russia did not need to be in that war particularly. It went into the war because it sought to engage directly with Germany, because these were the two major powers in East and Central and Eastern Europe. This war, as I said, is very unpopular, and it leads to two revolutions in Russia. The first is a bit earlier in the year, I think March. It's not important because the important one is the one that takes place in October,
of course,
which takes the country towards the path of communism.
Yes.
The first proclaimed communist state. This is the Soviet Union.
Absolutely.
And what happens is that the new rulers of Russia, of communist Russia, hate the feudalism, but love the territory of imperial Russia. Yes. So instead of concentrating on Russia, they, in a sense, try to incorporate, and very successfully incorporate, the other territories of Russia. which span really from bordering Germany at this time, because Poland was part of Russia. Poland was part of Russia, all the way to bordering Mongolia. So it's a very
vast territory.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Ukraine is a part of these territories. And so what happens over time is that there are, of course, ethnic differences.
Yes.
There is what's called the White Russians, who are the original Russians who formed the Federation of Russia probably around the 13th century,
Right.
the birthplace of Russia. But there are other groups. There are Turkic groups. There are other Slavic groups who are closely related to Russia in terms of language and culture, but are not quite Russian. And Ukraine is one of the, Georgia as well, where Stalin comes from, the future leader.
Was invaded also in 2007, yeah.
Exactly. Although Georgia is different for having actually been the only piece of Russia in the Soviet Union that asked to be annexed.
Yes.
Which is a very rare event in the history of nations. But Ukraine stood out in this Soviet empire, as you might call it. It was the second largest in terms of population,
Right.
as well as territory. And so it was a site of problems. There were people vying for independence because part of World War I is the final attainment of independence.
Yes.
Poland finally achieves it. Many countries in the Middle East finally achieve it. And many countries that were formerly occupied by some colonial empires finally achieve it, though not Africa and Asia. Instead, they are transferred. But they are transferred to the victors.
Yeah.
But Ukraine stood out, as I said, because it was, in a sense, the breadbasket
Yes.
of the Russian Empire. But also it was ethnically different because vast majority of Ukrainians are Catholic, as opposed to a number of the vast majority of Russians who are Orthodox.
Yes.
And so, in an attempt to, well, first under Stalin, the period was one of difficulty for the Ukrainians. There was, for example, food collection as part of this collectivist experiment. Harvest,
absolute disaster, yeah.
absolutely, it's called the Holodomor, where basically harvests are collected, much like what we will see in China.
Yes.
With the failed experiment of the Great Leap Forward. So after the death of Stalin, it was after the 1950s, there was an improvement in a lot of the Ukrainians, partially, at least, it is believed, because the person who succeeds Stalin is Khrushchev, who is Ukrainian by birth, and so.
So take us to, because there's a very interesting point that you make, I think, with regards to the notion of gaining independence after World War I for many European nations, for many of the Middle Eastern nations as well. However, African nations were then transferred. There was no real opportunity for African countries to gain independence. As we all know this, we went through probably some of the heights of our colonial era during that time. What Russia is characterized as, or let me say the USSR, is characterized as a hero in many African instances because they financed liberation movements. They trained liberation leaders. They educated liberation leaders, right? So you say something very interesting in the article with regards to that, with regards to the moral claim on the struggle of African people not falling on Mother Russia alone. So take us to that part of the history as well.
Sure. So as that leads nicely into sort of the point I was driving around Ukraine being an integral part
Yes,
of
absolutely.
of the Soviet Union. In fact, many struggle veterans are quick to say and have been very eager to say that in their training, they didn't just go to Moscow or to Leningrad, but they also got training in Kiev and in Odessa. So it was not purely that assistance came from Moscow. Moscow
Yes.
was merely the capital
Absolutely.
of the Soviet Union. But also the important thing to remember is that the Soviet Union was a federation. So all decision making, at least formally, was done on behalf of the entirety of the Soviet Union.
Absolutely.
And many successive Soviet leaders went to great pains to say we are not an empire. What we are is a conglomeration of free people who choose to have association with us. And I believe the Soviet constitution gave autonomy to different parts of the empire, of the Union, but also gave them the right, including and up to secession, should they wish.
Yes.
Although this is formal, some parts of...
I mean, in theory, many of those rights that were given to these states were really like indicative of equality within that Soviet atmosphere. Yeah.
Exactly. And the thing about this federation, as with all federations, such as the US, for example, states have their autonomy, but foreign policy is pursued in the name of all. There is one Minister of Foreign Affairs or Secretary of State.
That's very interesting.
Whatever the case may be. And so that really should checker the sort of claim that Russia has an exclusive or more elevated claim to Soviet history and this particular aspect of Soviet history. But also the late Soviet period is a very interesting one from the vantage point of the anti-colonial and anti-apartheid assistance. Because as I've read the memoirs of Rob Davis, former minister Rob Davis, who spent quite a lot of time in the Soviet Union.
Yes, and, Beyond the New Deal.
Yes, that's the title of his book. The point he makes there is that actually by the late 80s, the assistance was not so forthcoming anymore. In fact, they were being urged by some high-ranking officials to consider what actually P.W. Botha was proposing, which is a confederation, so a race-based kind of federation in South Africa.
Yes.
With qualified democratic participation, which would really be apartheid by another name. So that's really the importance, I think, of this historical perspective.
You know what's awesome about that? Because you're taking it back to the original logic of Russia's relationship with South Africa, which is also something that you unpack in the article, dating back to the 17th century, where the common misconception is that our relationship with Russia, right now that we learn it's actually with the Soviet Union in general, right, really starts during the colonial era, where our liberation movements were being championed and funded and aided by this conglomeration. However, in the article you take the opportunity to tell us about the history, about the Dutch colonial imperative and the the Russian Tsarist imperial empire having a strong connection in South Africa, and now that's circling back to this conversation in the 1980s around this issue of taking it back to more imperialist notions of governance rather than freedom as the ANC and liberation movements had foreseen it. So take us back there a little bit and maybe tie this Putin's Russia and Putin's iteration of Russia to this Tsarist, imperialist, white supremacist stance and posture that predated the Bolshevik Revolution.
Absolutely. So the big problem for Russia since time immemorial is that as big as it is, it does not have access to the sea.
Yeah.
Most of its ports are frozen over about 90% of the time in any given year.
Yeah.
And so as big as it is really a land empire. So it could not participate in the what you might call the era of exploration and colonization, the same way that Portugal pioneered, Spain soon followed, and then England and the Netherlands. So being basically landlocked, which is what Russia is, it is its eternal problem. It is landlocked,
Absolutely.
which means you can't be a naval power. It quickly scanned Europe for countries that could be partners in or perhaps facilitate or channel some of the benefits of the quote new world for the Russian economy. And the obvious choice for Russia was the Netherlands. Now, there's a long history of Tsar Peter the Great.
Yes.
When he looked around his country and he saw that it is really a backward country. It is economically speaking, socially speaking, it's not participating in the Renaissance, for example, in the same way that other parts of Europe were. So he took a trip to Western Europe, and there's an interesting story about the flag of Russia, that it was pretty much lifted from the Netherlands.
Yeah.
And
very interesting
they just
to read that.
rearranged the colors.
Yeah.
And this has not been definitively denied, actually. So what happens in this age of exploration is that Peter the Great enlists the services of Dutchmen to Dutch merchants, Dutch ship makers, basically to enlist among them Russians, basically Russian citizens. And it so happens that the place that the Netherlands finds most interesting, first as a refreshing station, and then as a colony to settle in, is the
Right.
Cape.
Yes.
Is the Cape. And through this Dutch-Russian connection, actually many of the governors of the Cape had linkages to Russia. And in fact, the first Cape-born governor of the Cape was a descendant of this Dutch-Russian connection.
Yes.
I just forget his name, but it's in the
it's a very
in the
long,
article.
difficult
Yes.
name.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think it's Frederick. Probably
Starts
going
with
to
an
butcher
S.
it, but I wish
Yeah.
if you'll allow me.
Yeah, no problem.
To look over here. But basically, he becomes the first Cape-born individual to. Okay, there we are. His name was Hendrik Swellengrebel, born in 1700.
And they taught us to
Quite-
pronounce their surnames, but it's good. Yeah.
It's quite a mouthful.
Let me be cheeky. Yeah.
Then the next major event is as Russia starts to be a little bit more outgoing. It has, for example, some relations with British ship makers. They docked some of their stations in Simonstown in today's Western Cape. But the next, I think, more interesting episode is during the Anglo-Boer War.
Yes.
Which is a name I don't really like.
Yeah.
Second
Talk to us about why you don't like that war. The name of that war.
Because I think particularly the second war had a lot of black participation.
Absolutely.
And a lot of black casualties, including in the concentration camps.
Absolutely.
That Britain really pioneered, because Britain was the first, in the modern era at least, country to prop up concentration camps.
Yes.
In 1899, 1900.
On this very territory.
Absolutely.
By the way, yeah.
Absolutely. So the Russians, this is a war that was between Britain and the Dutch settlers.
Yes.
Particularly those in the Transvaal and in the Orange Free State, over really the gold mines. Are pretty much where we are.
Definitely.
In close vicinity to where we are.
So I think I want to move on to the next conversation point, right? But before I do that, I want you to just qualify for our audience, why is it important that that specific myth is bust, right? The myth that, Russia is the most natural ally to Black South Africa. Why is that very, very important to bust as a myth in the first instance? And why is this history important to do that? Yeah.
Sure. So I think the art of foreign policy, or the science of foreign policy, is to not react in a sort of knee-jerk way
Right.
when you are making your decisions. And what the discourse or the narrative of Russia being a natural friend of Black South Africans does, or South Africa generally does,
Right. Yeah.
is that it restricts our options, and it sort of indicates to us or signals to us that there's only one sensible way to go.
Yeah.
There's no need to assess or evaluate a situation. It's sort of this view that I think Joe Biden said it, that if you don't vote for me, then you are not black, or something like this.
Yeah.
During the 2020 campaign. So in this incarnation, I think it takes away a lot of flexibility for South
Right.
Africa, which is absolutely essential in foreign policy making. That maneuverability,
Yeah.
and the ability as a sovereign country for South Africa to make its own decisions based on the situation. But I think it can also quickly poison and further polarize opinion.
Absolutely.
In South Africa, where if one wants to, for example, support the Ukrainians, it's as though you are blind to a certain version of history,
Right.
that dictates that you fall in line with Russia. But Russia, as perhaps we might get a chance to discuss later, is not an ally of South Africa. I think we tend to be
Yes.
very loose with words
Absolutely.
in terms of what is an alliance.
Let me get into that. Let me actually contextualize that. But for the audience, if you have any questions, feel free to throw your questions into the chat. We're monitoring your questions actively. Towards the end of the conversation, I will select a couple of questions as well, right? Because again, at the end of the day, it's really about our audience and the young people that are watching this to have a strong understanding, not only about this conflict generally, because there are a couple of lessons that we're learning here before I move on, right? The first lesson that we're learning is that whenever approaching any foreign policy issue, it's important to understand its context, the history, and the underlying politics that inform the way things work, right? But secondly, in order for us to build a better foreign policy, as you've said right now, it's very important to understand where your allegiances lie truly, which is the conversation I want to start now. Because another reason why South Africans would tilt their sentiment towards Russia is this, what is called the Brics alignment. And I think you're very famous for, especially in academic circles, for critiquing this alignment and showing people and proving to people why this has never been an allegiance that has benefited South Africa in any way, right? So unpack that a little bit, right? Because I want to talk about regionalism in two ways. I want to talk about Brics, and I also want to move on to Pan-African regionalism. You said something very interesting, for example, around the USSR standpoint, where although there were a confederation of different states, right? But when it came to foreign policy, they were centralized in specific strategic nodes. So I want to see, if we could have a conversation around that, considering how disparate our foreign policy is on the continent. But let's perhaps start with Brics.
Brics. Yes, so the Brics formation is really a collection of 5 countries that at one point were seen as the next, big thing, economically speaking.
Yes.
They were going to replace the US and EU-centered global economy. And
Nice big dream.
and every year I look at the statistics, or the projections rather. The years keep moving forward. But that aside, why I'm critical of the Brics as a sort of the notion that the Brics is an alliance is that it's really not. As I said, at one point or another, these were countries that were projected economically to promising. That was the basis to become the top economies in the world.
Yes.
And South Africa was sort of put in, and this for many.
Just kind of stuck onto the alliance more
Yes.
than really invited. Like, okay, bring them in.
As we argued, myself and my author in the book, The BRICS Order,
Yes.
that South Africa, the entrance of South Africa into, the invitation of South Africa into the BRICS was a pivotal moment, or should have been a pivotal moment, to say we are now moving from just being economically promising to now being also posing an ideological alternative to sort of the Washington consensus.
Right.
American domination of global discourse and institutions. There were going to be alternative institutions that were going to be propped up, but the money dries up very quickly. Russia, South Africa, Brazil's economies shrink and have stagnated for quite some time.
Yeah.
Really, then, it means the only game in town is China and India. The problem is China and India cannot stand each other. They have border disputes that are long-standing, also, of course, colonial, because the border between India and China is not very well demarcated when Britain left the line of actual control, as it is called. So, really, this notion of an alliance quickly falls apart when you consider that the countries do not have one common view. Three of them are democracies: India, South Africa, and Brazil.
Exactly.
But there are fascistic elements, even in terms of ethnicity and racialism. In India itself, the Muslims are suppressed by the majority Hindu
Population.
government and population. In China as well, there are questions around the Uyghur population, the Muslim population, the things we read about them being in concentration camps.
Absolutely. In what is so-called conversion camps,
re-education
conversion therapy,
camps.
re-education camps.
And
It's bad, yeah.
Yeah, and then there is Brazil, which is also tilted more towards right-wing populism. So that what you really find is that compared to the BRICS of 2009-10, when the alliance was still new, so-called alliance was still new, there were hopes of an alliance, there was at least common characteristics, right? These were strong leftist governments, mostly, India, Brazil, South Africa. But that has since changed. There's also an article I did on the potential for security cooperation.
Yeah.
And even there you find that, and that's really the basis of an alliance. And even here you find that there are limits. Even though every year when they issue their statements after the big summits, very expensive summits.
It's an alliance of summits.
Exactly. And they are every year. The big communiques that come out of these meetings are around cooperating on security. But when you look at the nature of the countries, it's really impossible for them to cooperate on security.
Yeah.
Because for an alliance to take shape, you must shed a bit of your sovereignty. It means, for example, India would be willing for Chinese soldiers to be deployed in its territory to combat terrorism, and vice versa, which is unthinkable. It means even Russia, also unthinkable, to allow Chinese or Indian soldiers in its territory.
Come into its territory, yeah.
Or to have a common security policy.
In fact, in the article, you speak about had this been a true alliance, there would have been a sense of consultation before this invasion.
Absolutely.
And
Because
the fact that there was no consultation just shows how cheap the alliance actually is.
absolutely, because what we've seen with NATO, for example,
Yes.
and the US is weeks and weeks and weeks of meetings and shuttle diplomacy to try to get a common position. Are we going to act? Are we not going to act?
Yes.
Whereas with South Africa, as you rightly point out, it was a surprise. It was a midnight surprise on the 24th of February. And that really just goes to show the lack of allegiance between these countries. And I go even further that the BRICS is not serving what should be its primary purpose, which is economics.
Yes.
Because I did an article on, I feel like I'm talking a lot about
Yo, shameless plugs, I love it. We're here for that, yeah.
On stock market integration.
Right.
Which is really to say, how much are investors in the different BRICS countries buying shares in each other's economies, in each other's stock markets. And this was made very easy for them because there is a standing agreement to allow them, for example, to buy stocks in each other's stock markets in their own currencies. It really facilitates the process. So this article in 2018 showed that really since 2010 up to 2018, for South Africa, there really wasn't much of a difference. In fact, South African investors were investing more proportionally in these other countries than
the other way around.
South Africa. Yeah, and the only real vibrant relationships are China by a long shot, and then India. Our trade with Russia, even in normal times, was far below the sanctions economy that we are
really
seeing.
ironic. Yeah.
Yeah. In other words, the current trade statistics or volumes between the US and Russia and EU and Russia and other countries that have condemned Russia are actually higher during this sanctions period than South Africa's trade with Russia in normal times.
That's insane.
So really, this just goes to show that the BRICS alliance or BRICS association is really China and the others as far as South Africa is concerned. And in fact, as far as the other countries are concerned, everybody is converging around China to trade with China rather than doing trade with each other. India is a close second or distant second, but increasingly growing, but still quite a wide gap. Yeah.
So let's talk about then regionalism insofar as the Pan-African conversation. Because then the big thrust of the discourse is, the fact that there are so many diverse sentiments regarding this specific war. Because Russia, again, has a sentimental claim on many people's history in liberation movements, right? So maybe just kind of transfer the conversation at that level as well. But I think what I also want to ask is, again, what is the notion of regionalism? Why is it important? And how can we envision a continent that can have a stronger regional presence from a foreign policy point of view?
Sure. So regionalism really is the beginning of international relations.
Right.
States interact most, at least in, almost said in normal regions, but in less extroverted regions. In other words, regions that begin first and foremost their international interactions with each other.
Yes.
Which is the case for really almost every other region or continent except ours, where the majority of the trade, for example, is with the countries in your vicinity. And then you work out what's called a customs agreement, for example.
Yes.
Where, which is what has been done. The oldest customs union is actually between South Africa, Botswana, Lesotho, and Eswatini, the SACU.
Right.
But in terms of, but these are relatively small countries that would complain actually that the balance of trade is very asymmetrical.
Yeah.
Which is why actually, as part of SACU, South Africa pays these countries to stay in the alliance. But this was an union creation before apartheid.
Yeah.
To really hang on to these countries
as far as possible.
Without, and because this is also a balance between the, what we might call now the Boers and the British, because the Boers wanted these countries annexed, or these territories annexed, whereas Britain wanted them as protectorates.
Right.
So it has this history that really it's not economics first, it was politics first.
Yes.
Because then after apartheid is proclaimed and these countries become independent, South Africa maintains the equilibrium so that it is not isolated internationally. But the point stands that it is internationally the norm, really, whether it's in Southeast Asia, whether it's in Europe, North America, for countries to do most of their trade with each other, which then informs, because they have common issues at stake, commercial viability and interdependence. This then informs the kinds of agreements that they have. They will have, for example, clauses such as the new 2019 or 2018, the new NAFTA, as some call it, the US MCA, the US-Mexico Canada Agreement,
Yes.
clauses around how we deal with external trade, how we deal with external trade, which may also entail trade with adversaries.
Right.
So trade regionalism is very political. It's a very political phenomenon because there's so much at stake. What kind of products you are allowing, and are they going to be, for example, as has been done sometimes, to get access to another market that has closed you off, you set up shop in a neighboring country so that you can easily export into the neighboring country.
Absolutely.
Which is really your target market. So basically, foreign policy questions are very closely tied with regionalism.
Absolutely.
With regionalism.
And is it a good thing or a bad thing that already, when looking at different conflicts across the world, we can't seem to agree? Is it, you know, an ode to our supposed independence as individual African countries, or is it an indictment on the fracturing that happened during the colonial era?
Sure. So I think it is to be expected that countries would have different viewpoints.
Right.
It's really to my point around there is no natural position for one to assume, for a country to assume on an issue. So I would not really expect the various countries to all have a common view.
Absolutely.
Because remember, we also have different systems of governance in the continent. We also have, and my little theory about why, for example, Eritrea was the one country that voted in favor, or rather against the motion to condemn Russia. We also have competing regional relationships.
Yes.
African countries do not have this, because it's politics, they don't have this homogeneous view on everything, nor do they enjoy peace necessarily.
At the same level.
They still compete, which is why I think Eritrea, for example, is more open to the notion of violence being used to get territory.
Absolutely.
Because it's the latest country to have done that in 1998. It sought to invade parts of Ethiopia so that it could take some of the territory that it felt it had been robbed out of during what we call the peaceful divorce between Ethiopia and Eritrea, where Eritrea became independent instead of being a province, essentially, of Ethiopia.
Yeah.
So there are many different viewpoints. There are many types of regimes, so that it's fundamentally unpredictable what position African countries are universally going to take on an issue. You see, even regionally,
yes.
Although Southern Africa, I think, was the most inclined to either abstain or not condemn Russia. And that may perhaps speak to South Africa's influence.
Yeah.
I really couldn't say on the motion. So all this to merely say that Africa is heterogeneous.
Yes. It's not a monolith. It's not one big block of people. It's many different countries with different
clashing
interests. Absolutely.
Sometimes clashing interests.
Definitely.
So it means there's no shortcut to Pan-Africanism. Essentially, there still is quite a lot of work to be done, including the character of the systems of governance or system of governance, and really an evaluation of our interests, and I use our broadly for the continent, what they are in the world. I know many colleagues, for example, who've done research and even spoken to officials about why actually Pan-Africanism is not a natural position to assume.
Right.
That there are a number of...
Again, sentimentally, it's appeasing, but it's not natural.
Absolutely. So I have a former colleague at Wits who did, I think for his PhD actually, called, his thesis actually, called the multiple logics of regional integration.
Right.
And the question there is asking is, given that it's so self-evident that Africa, or countries in general, groups of countries, stand to benefit most when they act as a union, in unison,
yes,
why has it not been case that they've done so. In other words, what's obvious is not always what's done.
Yeah.
And the findings there are really quite compelling in the sense that we actually, don't take African countries seriously enough when we think that they should just unite and form one big union. There are clashing interests politically as well. Some interests are at stake, including the current elite in those countries. It took Europe, for example, centuries of war and really catastrophic wars
Absolutely.
to finally assume the position of pan-Europeanism or European Union.
Which is an extremely recent phenomenon. Yeah.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely. So the point that he makes in that, at least one of the points he makes in that thesis is precisely that the costs don't outweigh the benefits. The costs of acting individually so far have not outweighed the potential benefits to be gained from acting as a group.
It's really powerful. And it leads me really to the last part of this conversation, which is around foreign policy. Because you say something so powerful in this article, and really it's your last line, it's my favorite line in the entire article. You say this. You say, I have it here printed. Shout out to me. South Africa's foreign interactions can be best described as diplomacy without foreign policy. So unpack that for a second. What's really the difference between diplomacy and foreign policy? And why do we find ourselves in a situation where our interactions with global nations is so ad hoc?
Sure. It is really a view I've come to for quite some time because of my observation and analysis of our interactions on the globe. When it comes to foreign policy, it is a question of survival. It is a question of your interests abroad. And really, I argue that South Africa is, first of all, not the only country to have this. And nor is it necessarily a bad thing. But it means in terms of resource allocation and our understanding of our country, we need to be realistic. What are the red lines, for example, of South Africa internationally? What are those things that we can say our stakes and our very survival depends on these outcomes internationally? And it's very few countries that can answer that question for themselves. And so it is really the case that what South Africa has is a bunch of embassies across the globe trying to attract investment to South Africa. And occasionally, the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation will issue statements to condemn. But that's really it. It never goes any further than that.
Yeah.
And you can't claim to have a foreign policy if it merely revolves around making statements with words instead of actual actions.
Right.
And the point there is really that, there are many reasons why this is the case. It's true that what the people in charge of South Africa and South Africa's foreign policy, the ruling party, are themselves really more a coalition than a single party, which means there are different viewpoints that need to be reflected in the outcome. And it's really ever the case that they agree fully on anything. It's famously a broad church. It calls
Such a powerful point,
It calls itself a broad church.
Yes.
But also more than this, going back to the point around regionalism, the countries that have foreign policies either have hostile neighborhoods or interests in the distant abroad.
Right.
So you can think here.
I was going to ask that because, they draft the Washington Consensus, and it becomes, a document that is the driving document post-Cold War. And it's going to inform the world order in general.
Precisely.
But it's informed by a superstructural political end that has, that has a lot more to do with the world than them alone. Yeah.
And that's just not the case with South Africa.
Yeah.
Because we live in a very friendly neighborhood as far as South Africa is concerned, at least at a state-to-state level. I know people-to-people relations are not always their best, as we've seen in recent weeks.
Yes.
In inflammatory remarks and actions towards Africans in South Africa.
Right,
And
100%.
on a state-to-state level, the relations are actually very peaceful, which is it's difficult to say you have a foreign policy in that context, because foreign policy is about containing hostile entities or hostile neighbors. It is about advancing your values abroad if you are so inclined. It is about more than just having an embassy in another country. That's mere diplomacy. And really, even this, I think, is overinflated, and really some people are overpaid, because since the formation of the World Trade Organization and South African entry into the World Trade Organization,
Right.
much of the work of an economic diplomat is really non-existent, because the formal structure for trade liberalization, which is what South Africa is pushing for access to other markets, is already a matter of international law. So that what the economic diplomats should be doing is working themselves out of existence to operationalize those agreements on a bilateral level and really cease to exist. And then the investment question, trying to attract foreign investment. This is where, again, I argue,
which is probably the thrust of our foreign policy, very utilitarian.
And
It's
yet
about,
it's-
it's about us, investment, what we can get out of it, as opposed to like principles that we actually, on paper at least, hold dear.
Absolutely.
Like freedom, justice, equality. Those are, things that are enshrined in our constitution, however, do not reflect themselves in the way that we interact with other states and other parties that completely obliterate these values. Even countries in our very continent, regionally, even our own neighbors, where we basically have more allegiances with former liberation movements that oppress their people than we do with countries that, at least adopt a more democratic posture.
And that just further adds to the point around lack of foreign policy.
Right.
Because on the one hand, you get sort of ideological statements about all manner of things. When I read, and I talk about them not because I'm targeting them, but because they're the people in charge, the ruling party.
Right.
In their resolutions, they speak about the need to, especially because the latest conference took place in the wake of the election of Donald Trump, and they, in that document, in their resolutions on international relations, speak about the need to really disengage from the West. And yet, when it comes to trying to get investment in your country, we just had an investment roadshow
A couple of weeks ago.
And it was really Western tailored.
As per usual.
It was so that this incoherence, basically, where rhetoric is out of step with action.
Right.
And as you rightly point out, investment attraction has become the sole objective, really, of our foreign policy. Everything else is really just empty talk, as far as I'm concerned.
So let me jump into one of the audience questions, right? So we have a question here from Munaka Munyai. Should African, so the question is, should African
Nice
countries,
music.
yeah,
Nice music, by the
shout
way.
out to the music over there, just kind of like giving the question some atmosphere. So should African countries foreign policy be intuitive to nations' individual allegiances, or should they strategically align to the greater goal of providing African unity, especially in context of how the AU presents itself to the UN? Very good question.
Very, very good question. I think the people arguing for Pan-Africanism, and I'm one of them,
Right.
should do a better job arguing for Pan-Africanism so that the benefits of Pan-Africanism become evident and actionable and pursuable. As the question points out, the first assumption or the first position of a country is to look at itself and its best interests. It just so happens then that we are not yet in a case where the best interests of country X are also the best interests of country Y. At least this has not been definitively demonstrated. And so really it demonstrates to me that the Pan-Africanism is not self-evidently beneficial, and that in terms of foreign policy making, you really need to go a long way in convincing a country to go one way or another. And to demonstrate, it is still the case that 60 years after independence, there are very few incidents that we can point to of African cohesiveness. And one of those...
And even the notion of Pan-Africanism is also so old itself.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think this is where a bit of regional leadership is necessary, where because it is an extremely costly process to get regions operating as one.
It
means, in some instances, to our earlier point about SACO, paying certain countries to
it's about interests, right?
Exactly. And that's where the notion of regional hegemony comes in. It's just universally the experience that regional groupings that have managed to operate in unison have done so under a regional leader. And that's where South Africa could play that role, but it's increasingly incapable of playing that role because of this incoherence in our foreign policy, our own foreign policy, let alone regional interests.
This broad church foreign policy. And so, because we're coming to the end of the conversation, in fact, I'm running a little bit over time, and this is the nature of conversations that I host within the Tshimong space. I'm quite famous for that, running conversations over time, so I'm going to get killed after this. But anyway, I'd like you to state, right, as we park this conversation, because so much has been unpacked, right? Firstly, we talked about the history of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, talked about the Soviet Empire at large, and the politics regarding that, but also the politics of moral claim when we associate Russia with our own South African and African struggles during the colonial era. We then spoke about this notion of regionalism, critiquing Brics, right? And really not calling it an alliance, being brave to say that Brics isn't an alliance if it isn't even able to achieve a sense of consensus regarding something serious as an invasion. And then lastly, we spoke about the notion of foreign policy a little bit. We touched on the notion of foreign policy, critiquing ours, right, where it's diplomacy without foreign policy. So then, literally last 2 minutes, how then, speaking about South Africa only, right, how then do we create a sound foreign policy that could be instrumental to achieving peace? What can we imagine as young people when we get into office one day to look out for in order to build this kind of foreign policy?
I'm so glad you asked. So for me, really, the foreign begins domestically. I think, I'm sure it's a tired sort of old statement that we need to, before you are able to or even envision sort of moral grandstanding and global social engineering, you need to be strong at home. And really we are not. Hence my sort of preparatory note that this might sound cliche to many people, but really it comes down to investing in the basics. In education, in infrastructure, in border security, in a number of basic things that states that can be taken seriously on the globe are able to do. This then, I think, has a spillover effect in terms of our military capabilities. Because it's just the case that we live in a world where, as one American president once put it, you need to speak softly but carry a big stick. And I've said time and time again that this conflict and conflicts like it, because there will be many in the future, require a country that has at least one aircraft carrier. You need to have certain military capabilities. And in order to bring about peace, it's just the case that if you are arguing for world peace, you need to do so from a position of strength. You need to have military capabilities in order to insist on world peace. You can't just be, as we currently are, somebody shouting from the corner of a street, basically shouting out jejunities and really tired statements that have no firmness to them.
Absolutely.
Because nobody really believes you in any case. You have no stick or carrot to wield.
Exactly.
So it comes down
People
really,
believe China for the same reason.
Exactly.
People believe the US for the same reason, right?
Precisely. And this is not to say we must be preparing for war.
No, yeah.
But that actually war will come to your doorstep, or that a war in which your interests are at stake will potentially materialize. And our interests really are not just material, but our people, as we've seen, we have a huge diaspora in Ukraine, people who went there to study. And this goes back
Absolutely.
to why aren't there good enough universities, first of all, in South Africa and Africa for people to retain on this continent. But it also shows that you will find yourself where your citizens are held hostage. You will find yourself in a situation where you have to be firm, you have to be materially strong. So basically, it is to the current generation and future generations of leaders
Absolutely.
to ensure that South Africa is strong first and foremost on the basics, because this has spillovers to our image and our voice internationally.
Absolutely. So it's basically just garnering our own sovereign power. It works as concentric circles where you start in the inside and it radiates from the outside.
Absolutely.
And you become a powerful actor and a figure within the global context
And
in
we
general.
must aspire to be internationally important. I hear a lot of talk, for example, criticizing South African exceptionalism. I think you must believe in the goodness of your country, of course, with justification, your country as a project, for it to be strong and for Africa to be strong. I don't think for Africa to be strong, South Africa will have to self-hate and be weak. I think Africa requires strong, independent African countries that can then coalesce and pursue a common goal. But it begins with valuing South Africa first and foremost and working towards a strong South Africa and not being guilty about this.
Sure. Yeah. That's a very, very powerful parting shot. And, that's really what we aspire towards here as Tshimong Talks, because Tshimong is what we say is that we are growing citizens. That's our slogan. And that is why platforms like these are so important to us, because we trying to inspire young people, the young people that we serve, and we are ourselves young people, right? Yeah, we're still young people. It's fine. I'm graying here and there, but I'm still within young people. I can be in the youth league if I want to. But anyway, right? So we do these talks so that, we can engage and ignite a sense of inspiration. And so that the people that are in the seats at home, on their phones, on their laptops, in the university spaces, listening to these conversations, can imagine themselves as the decision makers that will mold the kind of foreign policy that you've just described right now. A foreign policy that really is a state policy that goes back to the basics and getting it right? So before I let you go, sir, I want to introduce one of our, one of our alumni who's also on the call as well, and she's going to come in and do a vote of thanks. I'm wondering if she's ready, and she's ready for that thing. Monaka, how are you? Oh, there she is.
Hi, yeah, I'm ready. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible, we can hear you. Yes, please deliver a vote of thanks for Dr. Ndzendze.
Okay, great.
Yes.
So firstly, I'm just super grateful to be in a space where I get to be witness to one of the greats in the education sector that's still so young and able to lead change through conversations such as these ones, which are really, really important, because the prospect of a third world war in our generation is something that's crazy to fathom for us. So thank you so much to Dr. Ndzendze for being inspirational and impactful and insightful in today's conversation, and just delving into some really important myth busting for young South Africans about how the history of our country at present informs its relations to our foreign policy and the consideration of the influence that we have, just in ensuring that there's some transformation around that in the future. So thank you so much for that incredible conversation. We are rooting for you, and we hope you continue to make strides in your work that changes policies, that changes minds, and that changes lives. Thank you so much. It was an honor having you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Monaka. Thank you so much for that. And with that, Dr. Ndzendze, thank you so much for coming onto the platform. Again, it was important, and this is for the Tshimong audience. I want you to understand that it's supremely important that whenever approaching a conversation this big, to understand it first and foremost as complicated. Anything and everything is complicated. We are critical thinkers, and with that being said, whenever we make judgments and conclusions, they need to be from an informed place. So thank you so much for helping us navigate this specific conversation, because it really isn't about Russia, Ukraine. It's about foreign policy. And it's about what we can aspire towards as a nation, and potentially also as a continent, as we strive and trudge towards this realizing Pan-Africanism, realizing allegiances that make sense to us. And look, for everyone else, this is Dr. Bhaso Ndzendze. For me, it's Bhaso, right? It's not for everybody. So Bhaso, thank you so much for coming through.
Thank you, Tammy, and thank you to the Tshimong family, and Monaka, thank you very much.